So let's go full screen here. So I have a blank PHP file here, or it'll be a PHP file in a moment.
Could you actually increase your
Yes.
font size a little bit?
Yes, I can do that.
Yes. There we go.
All right. Okay. So first of all, let's go over to our WordPress install. Have a little localhost setup right here, and let's go to our plugins page. And here we have a whole list of plugins. Anybody who's used WordPress is familiar with this. It's just a list of plugins that you can activate or deactivate anytime. Now, what is it that makes each one of these a separate plugin? It's actually really, really simple. A plugin is nothing more than a single PHP file in a certain location that has what we call the plugin header at the top. And the plugin header is simply this. I have now made a plugin. And if we go in here to WordPress and we search for my test plugin, there it is.
Boom.
And we can activate it. It's really, that's it. I mean, obviously there's much more to plugin development than that, but I have now made a plugin. And now what that means is that this is a PHP file that WordPress is loading. So in this plugins page, we have all these different plugins, and we can see that there are 13 of them that are active. As WordPress loads, so as the WordPress admin loads or the front end loads, it's going to go and look and see, it's going to find all the plugins that are activated. And so a list of plugins that are activated is nothing more than a list of the plugin files. So my test plugin, it's telling me that my test plugin.php is an active plugin. And what that means is that it loads that file. So now any PHP that I place in this PHP file is going to be executed. For example, very simple PHP statement that says print the word test to the screen and then kill everything else.
Yep.
And there it is. We can see test up here. So that means that my PHP... I broke it all. Not the first time that's happened. So any PHP that I place in this file is now going to be loaded when WordPress loads. And that's a plugin. We can go a bit further, obviously, and we can do things like we can add a description. So this is a sample plugin. Add an author. And the plugin header is nothing more than metadata. We're simply defining the description, the name, the author, the version, etc. And if we go back over here to plugins, we'll see that information is now displayed, which it is. So that's a plugin. Once you've started with that, you can now, it's really up to what you know how to write in PHP. So let's go take a look at an actual plugin. And I'm going to zoom out just a tiny bit. Can you guys still see that?
Yeah, that'll probably be fine.
Okay, great. So first of all, let's go take a look and see what this plugin that I want to show you actually does. It's a plugin called Transients Manager. Transients Manager is...
Slightly on your actual browser.
Okay.
Just for people who have bad connection. That's definitely better.
Okay, and I'll try to go a little bit slower in case I'm going too fast here. So Transients Manager is a plugin that I wrote that's a developer tool. It's designed to allow you to manage the transients that are stored on your site. Okay, what is a transient? A transient is a database option. It's something that's stored in the database that for all intents and purposes is good for caching data in a kind of a pseudo cache. Let's say, for example, that I build a plugin that talks to Twitter. And I want to go pull in the latest tweets from my user account. Now, when that happens, that's a remote request that we're going to go send an API call to another server, get some results back, and then we're going to display those results. Now, because we're talking to another server, that can be rather time-consuming. So it can take a little while to do it. And so we don't want to do that on every page load. So after we get those results from a remote server, we might want to cache them. And then we're going to display those cached results for, say, the next 30 minutes. And then once the cache expires, we'll go get them again. That's something that you would use the Transients API in WordPress for, is caching that kind of data. WordPress uses them all the time. For example, on your WordPress site, you have an update system. we can go in and we can see that there are 4 plugins that are ready to have updates installed for them. WordPress uses the Transients API to store the results of those update checks. So once or a couple times a day, it talks your WordPress site, sends an API request to wordpress.org, gets back a response and says, these are the plugins that need updated, and then it stores those in a transient. So as a developer, if we're working with transients, sometimes we need to delete a transient or see what is stored in a transient, see what value is, etc. So I built a little plugin called Transients Manager. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. Somewhere around here, is it? Ah, I already have it activated. Okay, so what it does, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So it registers a new menu under the Tools menu called Transients. And here, it looks a little ugly, but it's more functional than anything. It displays a list of the different transients that are stored in our database and shows us the name of the transient, the value of it, how long it expires, and then gives us the ability to edit or delete it. Now, let's look at a transient that's easy to understand. So here's one. Affiliate WP, which is a plugin I wrote, is a commercial plugin, and it has a license key. Now, a couple times a day, it checks to see whether or not that license key is valid. And it stores the result of that check inside of a transient. So AffWP license check, the value is invalid. So the license key on this site for affiliate WP is invalid, and it expires in 23 hours. So let's say that I, as a developer, I'm trying to test that license check function to see if it works. Okay, I know that in order to trigger a new check, I just need to invalidate or delete the transient. I delete it, and now it will go and fire that check to see whether or not it fired, or to see if that license key is valid. And if we refresh the screen now, it should have fired the request, and there it is. So it's now created a new check, and it's still invalid. So that's what this plugin allows you to do. It's a little developer tool that can be really, really handy if you're working with transients. Now, let's go and take a look and see what this looks like from a developer's perspective in terms of the overall code in the plugin. It starts, just like our little sample plugin, with a plugin header. So you can see plugin name is Transients Manager. We have a plugin URL. That's the URL that your author name is going to link to. Sorry, that's the URL that's going to be shown on the plugins page over here, like when it says like visit plugin website, right here. It's got a description, a version number, an author URI. So my name is going to be linked to my website. And then contributors. And contributors is your WordPress.org username. Now, this plugin uses a class, it's based in object-oriented programming, which some people are not going to be familiar with. So it's usually something that people will get into as they get into a little bit more advanced development. But the overall plugin still works the same. Basically, all of our functions, all of our code that's in the plugin gets wrapped in a class. So this class gets loaded at the same time that our plugin gets loaded. And the first thing that happens is our constructor gets called. Our constructor is for all intents and purposes is nothing more than a wrapper function that says, hey, when this plugin loads, do these things.
Yeah.
And when that happens, go ahead.
If I can jump in real quick,
Sure.
Can we go down to where, since the class declaration doesn't itself execute, can you just show us real quick how that constructor gets invoked?
Sure. So the constructor gets invoked by, at the bottom of our file, we simply say new PW Transients Manager. When that happens, because of the fact that this is not wrapped inside of a class, here, actually, let me do something real quick. Let me do this. Oh, it's going to be annoying. There we go.
Sure.
So now, here's all of our plugin code, and here's the very bottom of the plugin.
Right.
Now, you may recall from here that any PHP code that we put in here is going to get executed. So this class is not executed because we didn't tell it to be executed until we get to here. So this basically says, hey, WordPress, load an instance of this class.
Right.
And when that happens, this is called.
Yeah.
And that's just standard object-oriented programming in PHP.
Yeah, so just from a beginner perspective, the class declaration just tells PHP that this type of entity can exist, and it's not until you say, I want a new one of that entity, that it comes into existence, right?
Right. So here's a simpler example. Let's say we write a function, do my stuff. When I do this function is not going to be executed when this plugin is loaded. But if I say this, now whatever is in this function is executed.
Right.
So what's going to happen here is this is going to execute this function, which will return this string, and it will be printed here.
Yeah. And so then the construct method on a class is the magic thing that happens in PHP when you say new.
Right. It basically says, hey, when this class is constructed, when a new instance of this class is set up, fire this.
Right.
Okay.
So that's where you put your hooks.
Right. Well, it's one place that you can put your hooks.
Right.
What a lot of people
where you put your hooks.
Right. It's where I put them in this case. What a lot of people will do is in their constructor they will have they'll have a method in their class called init or hooks or something like that, and then they'll put them there. Now in this case, I just added them directly to the construct method. Now, WordPress has a Hooks API, which is really the backbone of the plugins API, which is add action and add filter. I'm not going to get into exactly how those work, but if you're going to write plugins, there are things that you have to know how to use because they're used all the time. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey WordPress, when you start the loading process, when you initialize, I want you to run this function that I've called text domain. Hey WordPress, when you load your admin menu, I want you to execute my function called tools link. And then WordPress, when you initialize the admin area, I want you to execute this function called process actions. Is really what's happening here. Now, the text domain function, this is one that is really important for plugins that are released to the public. So if it's a plugin that's released on WordPress.org, if it's a commercial plugin, or a plugin that's distributed in any way, this is the plugin that allows it to be translated into other languages. We're all speaking English right now, but what we have to remember is that English is not the majority language in WordPress. There are more non-English users than there are English. So just because we wrote our plugin in English does not mean that everyone else is speaking English that's using it. So we need to allow people to translate our plugin into other languages. And that's what the text domain is used for. Basically it says, I want to load a translation file. So if someone provides a translation file, let's load that instead. And a translation file is nothing more than basically a list of strings that says, here's the English version, or the original language version. Here's the other version. So if we're talking about German, here's English, here's German, for every single text string that's in the plugin. And that's what that's used for. Then, at some point in our plugin, we need to add our menu item. So if we go back over here, we see Tools, Transients. There's a WordPress function that allows us to load this. And it's called Add Management Page. WordPress actually has several different functions depending on where you want to register your admin page. Maybe you want to register under Tools, maybe under Settings, maybe under Plugins, Appearance, maybe you want to do a new top-level menu, etc. I was executing. So there's several different places that you can register it. In my case, I wanted it under Tools, so I used the one called Add Management Page. There's a bunch of different ones you can use. Basically, it just sets up what the title of your page is, what the name of your menu is, and then we have what's called a callback function. And the callback function is simply, this is the code I want you to run when we try to display this page.
Right.
And it's, go ahead.
To loop back to the internationalization thing,
oh, sure.
When you register that menu, you're actually using a function to make it easy to internationalize,
yes.
Which is that double underscore.
That's a very good comment. Okay, so looking at Add Management Page, for example, here's our title of our page, Transients Manager. Or no, sorry, this is our menu title. This is the title of the page. So if we go over here to WordPress, we can see Transients. And then up here in our tab, we see it says Transients Manager. Now you see that these are pass through a function called double underscore, and they have this weird thing called PW Transients Manager. This is what we call a text domain. Basically, it's telling WordPress where this string right here comes from. So PW Transients Manager is simply the ID that I've given my plugin. Stands for Pippin Williamson Transients Manager. The double underscore is what allows this text to be dynamically replaced by WordPress. So when I say double underscore, I'm basically saying, hey, WordPress, here's my English version, and here's a text domain so that you can identify where this is coming from. If you have a translation, use it instead. So even though I've written this in English, if WordPress knew that there was a German translation available, it could display the German version or any other language. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so when we load this page, basically it's executing a function called admin. And this is basically just a function that is a mishmash of PHP and HTML, which some people hate, some people love, but whatever. And it's just setting up a table that's displaying all of our transients. So we have some arguments up here that are basically just setting up things like pagination, how many do we want to display per page, things like that. We don't need to get into details about that, though. And then we have a function that we call getTransients. And it's simply a function that I wrote that says, okay, let's go to the database and let's find all the transients that we have. Then, if we have transients, we're going to go down here. I'm going to skip down for a second. Here we go. So if we have transients, we're going to loop through each one, and we're going to display the data for each one of them. All of this HTML up here is just standard, just building the table up here.
Sure.
All right. So then we have a couple options on this table. Like, for example, you want to edit a transient. So we can go in here. And now this is obviously a different screen. So if we go back up here to the top, you'll see we have this thing that says if the action variable in our get superglobal, the get superglobal refers to everything in this URL.
Right.
So if the action is not empty and the value of it is edit transient, we're going to display a different screen. So if it's edit transient, we're going to display what's in here. Otherwise, we're going to display what's down here. So here, between else and endif is where we have our table, which you see here. And everything between if and else is where we have our edit screen.
So rather than make those two different pages that WordPress knows about, you've just made them one sub-page.
I've made it one single page that then just modifies the HTML that's displayed for each one. And you can do it either way. Both ways work perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And you can see we can go in. We can save transient. Okay. So the rest of the HTML is pretty straightforward. The big one that we should look at is how should look at two things. We have a transients function. So this is something that you're going to do, that I really like to do in plugins, is write helper functions. So WordPress provides a lot of functions to do certain things. Maybe it's the WP query class or the get post functions that allows you to retrieve data from the database. Now, depending on what your plugin does, you might want to retrieve a very specific kind of data. And if you're going to do that a lot in your plugin, write a helper function that goes ahead and sets up all of the arguments for you so that you don't have to rewrite it every time. So that's essentially what I've done with getTransients. Is I wrote a helper function that says go get all of my transients based on these variables. I wrote another one that allows me to retrieve the total number of transients. So if we go back to our site here, we have pagination. Pagination. In order for pagination to really work, we have to know how many transients are in the site. In this case, there's 1,092 transients, which is a ton. Welcome to my dev site. But I wrote a helper function that simply says, count the transients. Oh, and by the way, if we have tried to search for a particular transient, let's get the number of search results it found. So we have these different helper functions. We have another one, for example, get transient by ID. So that simply says, if you give me an ID of a transient, return that transient. Some of these are functions that don't exist in WordPress, so I wrote them myself. And these are kind of things that you're going to do in plugins a lot, is to write helper functions that simply help you do things. That's why it's called a helper function. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever heard from a developer, his name is Jeffrey Way. He used to work for Envato, and now he works for or with Laravel, which is a PHP framework. But he said
he runs Laracast, which is a
Laracast. That's the one. Yeah. Awesome guy. He's watches video tutorials. He's a phenomenal presenter.
Yeah.
But one of the best pieces of advice that I ever heard from him is break your code up into as small chunks as possible. And that's where you're getting into helper functions. So, for example, we have one called getTransientName. Let's go look and see where this is used real quick. It's used up here in our edit screen. And we have getTransientName. Now, if I wanted to, I could go ahead and do whatever this function is doing here directly in my HTML. It would still work exactly the same, but by abstracting it down into its own little helper function, I break that logic down and I keep it confined. So any logic related to that happens in this function. It also makes it much more reusable, so I can use it in multiple locations of my plugin over and over again. Something that you really want to try to avoid is what sometimes we call God functions. And that's basically a function that does anything and everything. Everybody who's written a lot of code is guilty of this at some point in time. I could point you to numerous examples that I have still out in the wild of God functions that do way more than they should. A function should do one thing and one thing only. So this one, right here, gets the name of the transient, nothing else. This one returns a transient by the ID. This function returns a transient value. That's it. The transient's expiration time. The expiration time in a human-readable format. So each one of these functions does one thing, and that's all they should ever do. So when you're writing your functions, try to do one thing and one thing only.
Right.
Now, in plugins, there's a lot of times when there's kind of weird cases where you have a function that is a function, but it's not doing the normal, I don't know, function-y things. For example, process actions. So process actions is the function that handles editing transients, deleting transients, etc. It basically says, okay, what is the action that the admin has requested? Delete a transient, update a transient, delete expired transients, etc. And then it does these different things. So it's really a wrapper function that calls in other ones. So if the admin has requested that we delete a transient, it calls the delete transient function. If we are updating a transient, it calls update transient. And so a lot of times these will not exist. Like in standard PHP outside of the WordPress world, usually this would just be its own .php file. But because of the way that WordPress works and how the WordPress loading system works, we want all of this code to run at a certain point in time. And in that particular case, it's during admin init. So when the admin area is initialized, we want to check to see if any of our actions should be run.